Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First to the students in our class, the introduction to the study of the Arab world. And I'm very pleased to welcome today all of you, also those who are online with us today. Welcome to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. My name is Marwa Dawoudi. I'm an associate professor of international relations at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. I am very pleased today to introduce Dr. Ahmed Abozaid, who is featured in today's event, the title being Tracing Alternative Epistemologies, Ibn Khaldun as a Global Theorist. And we have read also Dr. Abozaid's very interesting article on Ibn Khaldun, and he will be speaking about Ibn Khaldun's political theory, political thought to our students and to our audience. Before I delve into the event, I just want to share some thoughts with our students here and those online who have family, relatives, friends in Syria and Turkey and the region globally who have been very affected by the recent natural disaster, the earthquake. And we're thinking about you, and there's also possibility to aid throughout the university, but also organizations. And I wish all of you the best recovery. I want to introduce now our speaker. Ahmed Abozaid is a political scientist from Egypt. He is an assistant professor of international security at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. He was a fellow at Columbia University's program on exiting violence. His first English monograph on counterterrorism strategies in Egypt is published with Routledge's Critical Terrorism Studies series in 2022. Dr. Abozaid also published 5 books in Arabic and more than 70 peer-reviewed papers in leading peer-reviewed English and Arabic journals. He's an extremely prolific scholar, and I would say really a leading and emerging voice in the field that I'm very happy to welcome today. According to the Arab Citation and Impact Factor between 2012 and 2022, of more than 3,000 researchers from over 20 countries, Ahmed was listed among the top 3 most cited and most influential Arab scholars in the fields of political science and international relations. So Ahmed, you will talk about your work, your article, and then we will open the session for question and answers. The students, please raise your hand as we move along. And for those online, please write your questions in the chat box and I will bring you in. We will alternate between the audience and those online. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marwa. It's really a pleasure and honor today to be with you and with your students and the audience who wanted to join us and listen about Ibn Khaldun. Before I will start, I want also to share with you that our prayer and our consulting to the people of Syria and Turkey and everyone else around the world had been affected by this natural disaster that took place 2 days ago. We really pray that everyone will save and the families and everyone will be safe as soon as possible as well. And thank you again and for the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown for this generous invitation to share my work with your students and with the audience. And I really hope today we open a discussion about revisiting Ibn Khaldun more than about what I'm presenting, since Ibn Khaldun used to known as a historian more than a political theorist or sociologist. And if you don't mind, I will share my screen with you. Okay, I will try to summarize the whole talk today, and in just in case if we run out of time. So today I will talk about why Ibn Khaldun is still relevant after 617 years after his death, and not only as a historian as everyone know him, but also as a political theorist, which is still understudied and unexplored aspects of his work. I will also talk about the way his ideas and theories represent a serious challenge to the mainstream political science and international relations theories, and moreover present a new alternative to this epistemological and methodological debate. and editing invaluable knowledge to how we understand the world in the past as in the future based on his work. Overall, Ibn Khaldun, as everyone knows, lived in a moment of decline and global radical transformation. The importance of his writing is due to the fact that it was written during one of the most transformative period in history, which is the 14th century. Ibn Khaldun lived in what Antonio Gramsci called integranum, a time of master, where time of a change, a time of transformation. In the shadow of overstretched and in decline empires that extend for nearly 8 centuries, and what come after it, which is the rise of European West since the 16th century, which still dominates the international system until today. Amid of this turbulent world order, as I will call it, and as I will reveal later on, Ibn Khaldun worked and held many positions in most areas of the international system existing at the time of the 13th and 14th and early 15th century, where he worked in Granada, in Spain, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, and Syria, and elsewhere. Under these circumstances, he wrote his seminal work, which is Al-Muqaddimah, or the introduction, and Kitab al-Ibar, or history of Ibn Khaldun. Therefore, these writings, I argue, were based on practical and empirical study of the most societies and empires known in the global system up to the beginning of the 15th century. Two, these travels and professional experience and political experience make his writings a global rather than regional or local knowledge. I argue that Ibn Khaldun theory challenged the Eurocentrism, and this, in my opinion, is for one or primary fundamental epistemic and methodological reason, which is he was discussing and theorizing what philosopher of science and philosopher of history now call underlying principle or the governing dynamics of societies. Ibn Khaldun had a profound interest in identifying the main social forces that drive the process of constituting the state, which has been represented and manifested in his time in form of tribal-based power, or what he calls the Asabiyya, group solidarity. Yet, I argue that most of these dynamics and constitutive socio-political confrontation, either it was tribal, ethnic, sectarian, or professional, etc., that Ibn Khaldun argues that it exists to preserve and consolidate the power of the regime, did not change. In other words, these confrontation did not witness a complete disruption, even with the Western colonialism, modernity, and industrial revolution of the 17th century and aftermath, which in return make his theories epistemically in particular still relevant today. And I will try to show that today. So the talk in brief will be divided in 3 sections. I will talk about the world. I will try to put Ibn Khaldun in a historical, political, and geographical, and of course, epistemic context. And the second section, or the second part, I will talk about the person himself and how his professional and personal and political career give him an advance of most of the Theorist until the end of the 19th century. And finally, I will try to give an overview about his theory and modern interpretation of his theory based on my work that have been published and now under review as well. So the first part, we will talk about the world. So Ibn Khaldun, born in 1332 and died in 1406. But this is not, his life is not based on the time he lived in, but also about the whole world system that emerged after the 7th century, which witnessed the fall of Roman Empire until the beginning of the 15th century, or the rise of the West with the Portuguese gets through Africa in 1506. This is a world as we know it now from the 17th century, but this is the world before the rise of the West. Most of social formation or confrontation of the world or the world system, as I will elaborate more, before the 1500 were tribes, asabiyat, and cities, as opposite to the Bedouin or the nomad. So Ibn Khaldun was talking about what we can call it now, the state of his time or the nation state of his time, which was tribes. However, during this time, there were also advanced form of political organization and form of government, whether they were empires or independent state or kingdom. For instance, China, ancient Egypt, Iraq, and others, as recently discussed by Francis Fukuyama, among others as well. So it was not pre-modern, it was not chaos, it was not primitive communities as the mainstream or canonical IR argued before 1648, and we will come back to 1648. I here today, I am counting or building on a magnificent work, yet unfortunately understudied and overlooked by other, which is Professor Janet Abulog's work before European Hegemony that was published in 1989. So according to Abulog, she reveals to what extent or the extent of the complexity of the global system, politically, administratively, strategically, culturally, institutionally, and of course, economically, between the 12th century and the 15th century. She analyzed, her analysis contested and challenging the Eurocentrism in IR and world history, which takes Westphalia Treaty of 1648 as the starting point of what we know and study now as the modern international state system. This Eurocentrism erases the histories and contribution of non-Western world and portrays them as chaotic group, primitive, backward, bloody kingdoms that are not governed by law, order, or diplomatic arrangement. This view in Abulog's work has been completely refuted. For example, she theorized that between 1200 and 1500, there were 8 regional systems that work together and formulate international system or international society. And as you can see, the circle represents the regional system and the international society as it was established since 1100 to 1500. According to Abulog as well, multiple trade and financial routes were intertwined, and also these routes was organized, governed, protected, and secure as well. Also, other people developed this one by editing, if you can see the red circle as well, which is Al-Maghrib and the Gold Road, as we call it. We know above here's China, Central Asia, and Eurasia. This is the Silk Road, as we know, but the red one is the Gold Road, and it is slavery trade in the Islamic Empire as well. So this was a complex and deeply integrated and interdependent system. For example, the trade or free trade or interdependence during this time, these caravans began from Beijing in the east through Central Asia, which now the Silk Road, and through a network of ports down to the Indian Ocean and Bahr al-Arab to East Africa, across of ports across the Indian Ocean, then to the Red Sea, through the North Africa and to the Sahel, or the Gold Road through North Africa and to Morocco, and from there to the Muslim Spain, Andalusia, to Venice, to Paris, and to the rest of Europe. Again, this is just before the discovery of the so-called New World. This is the international system as exists until 1500 or even 1600. So that was the world as Ibn Khaldun knew and live and take apart. And I will explain more about that. The last point I want to, the last point in this part that I want to make is the issue of universality. If again, if you don't mind, I want to share something. Sorry, can you see this map, right?
Yes.
So this is the Islamicate empire, for example, and it's not Islamic and it's not Arabic Islamic, it's Islamicate, and Islamicate is referring to the mix of Arabs and non-Arabs and Muslim in the constitution of the so-called Islamic empire. This is how it starts. This is timeline from 700 to 1500. So it's from the 8th century to the 16th century. This is the Umayyad empire that expanded to the west and to Spain. The golden age of the Abbasid empire. This is expanding, as you can tell. So now it's Asia, Africa, and a part of Europe. Now we went to India as well, to the east, and the Mongol converted to Islam, and it's become a Muslim as well. This is the 13th century. 13th century.
It's
until the 1500, which is the 16th century as well, just before the rise of Europe. And if you can look at the West, where the Islamic empire in Spain had been completely abolished. So back to our universality. This is the Abbasid empire in its expand as well, and also because some people do not read English, I prefer to share Arabic maps as well. This is the expansion of the Mongol empire as well until the beginning of 14th century as well. So this is the international system as we do until the 1400. And this is a comparison between the Roman Empire of Byzantium and the Mongol, for example. So my point about this universality or the claim of universality, as the map shows, the Abbasid Empire and the Mongol Empire, canonical studies still insist that the historical experience of the West, which is a different and multiple experience that extend from the Greeks to the Romans up to the imperial European power in the 19th century, is the only universal experience that most of, or the rest of the world must be generalized and can be applied to the rest of the world, while other and non-Western experiences are local and culturally specific that cannot be generalized or claimed as universal experience as the West as well. So Ibn Khaldun is a Muslim scholar, but it's not a global. Confucius, any indigenous knowledge, it's just a local or cultural product that only applied for the societies that emerged from. But anything from the West, even someone like Kant or Hegel did not even leave their homes, they still claimed and portrayed as a global thinker. And we will see how the life, the rich life of Ibn Khaldun actually it challenged all these claims. In this presentation and my work, I challenge just biased, I call it racist, and I will show how it's racist, and Eurocentric claims which view the rest of the world as only an object of research, not as a known subject, as Ibn Khaldun case will show us. The map showed us, like, compare the size of the two empires and go back to the scholarship and the literature about global history, about theorizing politically or socially or economically, everything. It's the Eastern mode of production. It's everything about the Islamic mode or the Asian mode of production, but everything from the West is universal and applied everywhere. And actually, someone, for example, the latest example of this Eurocentricity was Professor Ahmed Abozaid book about the underdevelopment of Islamic world, which he claims that just because we are not following the via moderna or the European way of development and political organization, that's why the Arab world and the rest of the world is still non-democratic and underdeveloped. Again, Ibn Khaldun challenges these claims as well. So despite the size and the influence as well, the claims that universality limited to the West, on the other hand, although this civilization, as we will see, and the empire, as rigorously demonstrated by Abozaid's work, laid the foundation on which European civilization was developed since the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in the 17th century. So now the person, which is my favorite part of this work, we are talking about Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun, or his name is Waliyuddin Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun, born in 1332 in Tunisia to a rich family with a long history in politics, military, fiqh, and jurist as well. The origins of his family goes back to Sevilla or Ishbilia in Spain. Ibn Khaldun was born in era that we can call it now the age of decline and decay, where the 13th and the 14th century witnessed the full decline and disintegration of Islamic empires, the fall of Andalusia in Spain as a result of Reconquista wars, the disintegration of the Abbasid Caliphate in Asia and North Africa, as you can see in the map. This is now is Alamids, Mamluks and Ayyubid and Seljuks and other small sultanates and states after it was a part of the great empire. The decline of the Mamluk Empire in Egypt, the Lebanese and Arabian Peninsula as well, and finally the retreat of the Maghreb empires after the losing of Andalusia in 1492 as well, after the fall of Granada. On the other hand, this period also witnesses the rise of non-Muslim powers, such as the Mongols and the Crusade in Europe as well. This is the early Crusade campaign that started from 10th century to the 13th century as well. This is more clear one. Finally, this age also witnessed the spirit of the large-scale epidemics, such as the plague or the Black Death. This is where it started in 1346 and arrived to Tunisia in the middle, where Ibn Khaldun was still almost 15, 16 years old, where he lost his parents, most of his relatives, and his teachers and the scholar of his time as well. That's where he have to move to Andalusia and to the Maghreb. So overall, as we can see, Ibn Khaldun lived in a moment of decay and radical transformation. In these circumstances, he wrote his book Al-Muqaddimah, or the introduction, and Kitab al-Ibar, or Ibn Khaldun, history of Ibn Khaldun. The first time Al-Muqaddimah was written was in 1374 to 1377. And then he modified, revised, and expanded it in 1382. All of this time, he was still in Tunisia. The last revision of the Muqaddimah and Tarikh al-Ibar was made in Egypt in between 1397 and 1402, just 4 years before he passed away. One of the very interesting facts about Ibn Khaldun is that he wrote his autobiography, actually. He historized his own life as a public figure and as a politician. And he wrote this book in 1403, which is التعريف بابن خلدون ورحلته غربا وشرقا, or the life of Ibn Khaldun and his journey west and the east. And this book, actually, it's an excellent historical piece and really beautifully written about his public life, his political and social rules, how he developed and wrote his idea in al-Muqaddimah, the impact of professional life on intellectual and personal life and vice versa. And this is also in the 15th century, just before the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. These writings are important, in my opinion, because not only were written during one of the most transformative periods in history, the 14th century, where Ibn Khaldun lived in an interregnum, a time of Munster in Gramscian term, in which the old world, as we see, the Islamic one, was dying, and the new world struggled to born, which happened just less than a century of Ibn Khaldun, this, which is the rise of the West until today. In the shadow of overstretched civilization and in decline empires that extended for nearly 8 centuries, and what come after it, which is the rise of European West since the 16th century, which still dominates the international system until today. Amid of this turbulent world order and life, it's ironically enough, it's like you're talking about the 21st century epidemic, global war, the decline of empire and the rise of empire. That's what we will see the implication about that as well in other works. Ibn Khaldun's professional career and life experience were very rich in every sense. So, for example, and we're talking about 14th century person. He worked as a speechwriter to the Sultan of Tunisia, as a counselor, as a minister, as Bayer minister or Hajib. He was an ambassador to Cordoba, from Granada to Spain, King Alfonso II, I think. And he was politician and orchestrator of coups. And that's a very disturbing view about Ibn Khaldun. And of course, he was a scholar and a jurist and a judge in Egypt, a Maliki judge. And later on, he was Qadi al-Quda, or chief judge as well. This is a very rich CV. Besides that as well, Ibn Khaldun, this very rich life empowered him or enabled him actually to visit most of what we saw, or what we call it now, the international system of the 14th century. For example, he was born in Tunisia. I hope the stars is clear. He was born in Tunisia and moved to Andalusia to work with Granada king, back to Al-Maghrib al-Aqsa, which is Morocco now and Mauritania, and back to Algeria, Al-Maghrib al-Awsat, back to work with Tunisian kings as well, traveled to Egypt, to the Mamluki kingdom, traveled to Arabia as well, not only for Islamic reason, but also for observation. And later on, he almost arrived to the border of Turkey as we know it now. So if you can see now, almost Ibn Khaldun visited most of the international system, like the only circle or part of the world which was the Mongol. But for example, with the Mongol conquest of Damascus, Ibn Khaldun had the opportunity to meet with Timur-Lenk, where he asked him to write a book about Al-Maghrib and about Africa. And of course, in return, Ibn Khaldun have access to the information about the tribes, about the social structure, about social power, about structure of power in the East, as we know now. So all this experience empowered him to have access to all these areas and spaces. And this, by any interpretation, this is not local. Ibn Khaldun was not talking about the Berber. or the Amazigh. He was not talking about the Arab. He was not talking about the Muslims alone. He was talking about the international system of his time. His visiting field work, his ethnography, his empirical data, his access to men in power, his knowledge as a jurist, as a scholar, and most important, his travel. Like I claim that until the end of the 19th century, any Western scholar did not travel and see the world as Ibn Khaldun, not Hegel, not Machiavelli, not Kant, not even Karl Marx. Karl Marx, when we talk about India and Asia, he was talking about books. He never traveled these places. And it's not about traveling, it's about what we call it now the field work, the access to these spaces and to live there and know how the power, the society is constructed and the social origins of the power. So these travels served as an ethnography, a field work, an empirical data collection that provided him with a rich empirical data and observation and interviews. This data was the base up in which his world history or Kitab al-Ibar and al-Muqaddimah was constituted. So the theory, I'm sorry, I still have 10 minutes. I will try to summarize this one and we can talk about it more in the Q&A as well. This is his books, right? The 3 books, and actually Al-Muqaddimah is the first book of Tarikh Ibn Khaldun, which is 7 volumes as well. So Ibn Khaldun, the originality of his work, in my view, in my interpretation, that he was seeking or he was trying to theorizing underlying principle, or what philosopher of science calls the governing dynamics of any society. He was looking for the social power. He was talking about the main social forces in any society, not about summarizing history, not about the history of the king as al-Tabari, as al-Zahabi, as al-Mas'udi, or even as any other philosopher. Ibn Khaldun was not a philosopher, by the way, and this is another debate as well. So his work was, he based in his own political and professional career and his intervention in politics make him interested more about the foundation of social power, about the politics, about the state itself. So in his Al-Muqaddimah, which is, by the way, I was talking to Dr. Marwa, this book is like the most translated, published book in Arabic for more than 100 years. This is the last version of Al-Muqaddimah. I think we just get it last month from Jordan when I was there. This is just the book. This is his theory about everything. So in this Al-Muqaddimah, which by the way, the whole social issue is like 15 to 18 chapter of his book. So he was talking about the social formation or configuration, which is tribes of his time, and we will have traveled and modern interpretation of that, the social forces of any society, which is asabiya, and social origins of political power, identity-based solidarity, the logic of we versus them, and the function of violence, or what I call it, the lawmaking and law-preserving function of political violence, and the role of economy. And Ibn Khaldun was way ahead from Marx, from Adam Smith, from Ricardo about the labor theory and the value and the taxes, the role of government, and about division of labor as well. And of course, the role of discourse or religious, or I will call it ideology, or the apparatus to use it today. So in brief, the 3 main foundation of his theory is the Asabiyya, the dominant group of the social forces, al-ghalabatu wal-shawka, which is brute force or domination, up in which the Asabiyya was built its power. And the third one is al-da'wa al-diniyya, or religiously correct discourse or ideology. So this is a classic theory of Ibn Khaldun about state building and authority formation, as I call it. So we have al-dawla and the constitutive foundation of the state is based on عصبية and الدعوة الدينية. الدعوة الدينية, of course, is because of Islam and his time as well. And العصبية constitutes its power over الغلبة والشوكة والقهر. And الدعوة الدينية is based on الوعظ الديني, or to use Gramsci, is ideological apparatus. So to put it in a modern time concept, so we can talk about the foundation of the state, or the process, the dynamics of the state building is based on social forces in one hand and ideological apparatus. This social forces must monopolize the violence or the use of violence. And we're talking about 400, 500 years before Max Weber. Max Weber was the dominant scholar that state is the only legitimate entity that mobilize the legitimate use of force or violence. Macht. Ibn Khaldun never used عنف بالعربي. In Arabic, he used الغلبة والشوكة. That's why I interpreted it to law making and law preserving Gewalt, if we want to use Benjamin. And the ideological apparatus based on, of course, repression on one hand and manufacturing consent or loyalty on the other hand by soft. I call this to material violence and symbolic violence, but also we can expand this in the future. So this was 1406 until his death. But since then, Ibn Khaldun had been printed in almost every living language since 1600, when the first Turkish translation from Arabic was published. So he has been applied to explain or understand the rise of Ottoman Empire, the Safavid state in Iran and sub-Indian continent, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, of course. Until today, this is the 20th century cases. Syria, Lebanon, of course, GCC countries, Libya and Maghreb, Central Asia Republic. It's very interesting when I try to understand dictatorship in Central Asia, and Asabiya just come in clear. And in general, my reading of Ibn Khaldun that he can easily apply for post-colonial condition in general. This is, I have 2 points to wrap up. This is a modern engagement, in my opinion, the most serious engagement with Ibn Khaldun, or what I call it in another paper, the traveled reading of Ibn Khaldun. The first one, sorry, this is Muhammad Abid al-Jabri from Morocco, Abdullah al-Arawi, Morocco, the great political scientist Nazih al-Ayyubi from Egypt, Ali al-Wardi from Iraq, Absalam al-Shaddadi from Maghreb, and Dr. Hebra of Izzat from Egypt, and now in Ibn Khaldun University in Turkey. And in English, of course, we have Mohsin Mahdi, the most famous author in English about Ibn Khaldun and political philosophy in Islam in general. And this is the great Ibrahim Awais as well, from Georgetown, by the way. I don't know if you saw his photo as well of one of the corridors in your school. And Charles Awais as well, I think also with SAWAS or Georgetown as well, and Ghassan Salama from Lebanon, and he wrote in French as well, and considered the most famous scholar that engaged with Ibn Khaldun now is Sayyid Farid al-Attas from Malaysia. I will end up with some of my critique about Ibn Khaldun, or criticism about Ibn Khaldun. Besides, of course, Ibn Khaldun had been accused of many things: determination, overlooking the escapism or the circular reading of history, repetition. But for me, I'm not interested. I'm interested in his epistemic theory, political theory. So his theory overemphasized on the role of Asabiya, which lead him to ignore and overlook the rule and function of other social forces. And this is also related to his contempt of the common people. If you are not Asabiya, you are not significant for Ibn Khaldun. If you are not from people of Jah or mulk, you are nothing. So especially he really condemned the poor classes and al-hawash, al-awam, al-zu'ar, as we in Egypt or Syria or Lebanon call the common people. Thus, he really opposite and reject any claim of revolution, rebellion, or even call for reform if these calls are not coming from al-Asabiyya or adopted by al-Asabiyya. Asabiyya is the driving force of history for him. So it's a very essential, very central concept for Ibn Khaldun. And the fourth one, the third one is his chauvinism. Ibn Khaldun well known as that he is anti-Arabs, and actually I disagree with that. I have a different interpretation of Ibn Khaldun reading of history. His writing are highly charged, discriminated, ethically prejudiced, and racist toward Badawi and blacks and other racialized groups as well. But also, this is not an excuse, but we're talking about someone living 14th century, so it's not an excuse, but still we need to put this in our consideration when we talk about Ibn Khaldun today, to just not use him uncritically or unquestionably. I also have a problem with his positionality as well, as someone working revolution and was proud to take a part of the revolution in Egypt. So for me, dealing or working or cooperating with dictatorships, that's a problem for me. That's contradict everything I believe in my work as well. But Ibn Khaldun, actually, he deeply worked with dictatorship, with authoritarian regimes, with dystopic authorities, either from within or from abroad. Like he went to Damascus and meet with the Mongols despite everyone else. And he wrote, as I mentioned, when you read his life, it's really fascinating life, seeking for power and the lust for power and authority as well, or even the knowledge. The last thing, and I will end up here, also the gender question. And I would like to thank my friend Maya that she highlighted this one as well. After all, we are talking about a man of power as well, right? In a society where the agency of women and the age, not only society claims, in an age or a period where the agency of women was visibly restricted, ignored, and marginalized from public life and political engagement. And that's actually deeply manifested in his writing about history, about politics, about driving forces of history and change, where the role of men in his writing was glorified and the role of women was both ignored and understood. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry if I over.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Ahmed, if you don't mind stopping the sharing of the screen so that we can see you and have. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, for a fascinating lecture. I have to say I learned a lot, and I see the sophistication and extent of your intellectual trajectory, but also your research in questioning those issues, placing them in their context. And I think what I've learned is that Ibn Khaldun was really a pre-Renaissance man, right? In terms of his life, but also in terms of his writings. He's a global theorist, not only the Islamic thinker that he's always portrayed to be, limiting him to that Asian Muslim sort of category and not globalizing him. I thought it was fascinating also to see how you use maps to show the geographies of power, but also of knowledge, right? And the evolution over time. And his contribution at all levels. He was one of the originators of political science, political studies, long before Weber's monopoly of violence, long before these issues of violence and state control. He was also an early thinker about economics, and you shared with us, and I shared with our students, Ibrahim Awais, you mentioned him. He's a close member of, he used to be a close member to our center. His picture is out in the corridor, you're right. And he wrote about how Adam Smith and Marx could learn a lot from Ibn Khaldun because he set up these concepts early on. And he's also, I think, the Gramscian aspect about manufacturing consent in your visual, sort of graph was very interesting to see how also he's shown how the state can manufacture consent on the part of populations. I think this is all challenging Eurocentrism. This is what we discuss in our class, how to decenter, decolonize, bring back, sort of indigenous research, but which is also global. And I think we can now also open the floor. I want to thank our program manager and events coordinator, Coco Tate, because she's organized all that. She will also help me with managing the questions from the audience. And I will open the floor now to our students after your lecture and see what questions could come out. I want to say also, all of that discussion about Turaf, going back to, history versus reform, modernity, is at the core of the readings we had today. Al-Arwi that you mentioned, Jabri. We also read the Ladam, Mernisi, Abozaid, and others who have greatly contributed to all of that, Tarabishi as well. So I guess we will link to the other readings as well. Who would like to start? On decolonization? Yes, Mahmoud.
I have a question regarding how the theory can be used in modern day to explain many political phenomena. The concept of Asabiyya itself, I struggled when I tried on my own in the past when I first time read the Muqaddimah that to apply it to a modern context. For example, I struggled to apply it in the context of Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and even in context of Jordan, which might be built on that tribal sense. I struggle to find how is it still relevant in a context where that tribal factor is not apparent anymore, and it's more about only that part of his theory, which is the brute force or that is used. There is little ideological manifestation. For example, in of course it was available in Egypt's Nasser, but in the modern sense, there is no clear ideology that is there. And in Tunisia as well, there was under Habib Bourguiba, there was also this ideology, but it at the end it melted down to only brute force. So I would like you to hear you elaborating more on how can we apply it in the modern sense, in the modern world.
Should we go by one? One by one?
Yes, of course. You want to answer now? Go ahead, yeah.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. And please, if anyone wants to speak Arabic also, please just speak Arabic to just make our life easier. That's one of the question, the most repetitive question I received when we start to talk about Ibn Khaldun, how you bring someone from the 15th century to apply it now. And to dismantle this question, to address this question, I have two answers. The first one, about to what extent Ibn Khaldun is relevant or not, I will ask you the same question, why Thucydides or Kant is still relevant and not Ibn Khaldun? I have the right to say that, right? But this has been said epistemically. It depends about how you interpret Ibn Khaldun and others scholars concepts. So for me, I adopt traveled interpretation, flexible interpretation. Ibn Khaldun, when he was talking about Al-Asabiyya, for example, which I agree with you, it's the most essential one component of his theory, he was not referring per se to the tribe or the clan only, but actually he was talking, as I said, in my opinion, he was talking about the driving force, the driving social force in any society. In his time, if you agree with me that Ibn Khaldun is timeless or still relevant, in his time, this social force manifested, embodied in what he called al-Asabiyya. For me, I interpreted al-Asabiyya in political parties, in military junta, in Al-Ta'ifa secretaries, in even someone like Albert Hawrani, like he called it patriotism, حب الوطن, al-wataniyya, and this is Albert Hawrani. So for us, if you are interested in Ibn Khaldun, you have to look behind the surface of his time and the surface of his writings. In my opinion, my understanding of Ibn Khaldun, he was trying to theorize the driving forces of any society. For Asabiyya, for example, in Egypt, right? Because this is actually the most difficult question about applying Ibn Khaldun in Middle East. Not Iraq, not Syria, not even Maghreb, but Egypt, because this is the oldest nation state as we know it now in the Middle East. For example, the pre-colonial, post-colonial, and now, right? The pre-colonial, Egypt was ruled by one Asabiyya, which is Muhammad Ali family, until 1952. This is a manifestation, the embodiment of Al-Asabiyya. Muhammad Ali bring his own family and his own people from Albania, where he get rid of the Mamluk, the ulama, the public, between 1805 to 1822. And until Farouk was the last king, so until 52. If you want a flexible interpretation or modern interpretation, as I adopted, Al-Asabiyya for me in post-colonial Egypt is the army. The army represents an Asabiyya in a very loose way. This is also manipulating the use of force. It's based on group solidarity, based on belong to one group, which is the army. And of course, they have the national narrative about national security, saving the state, fighting imperialism, and now war in terror and the war against Muslim Brotherhood. Maybe you disagree with me. That's exactly what we need. We need new imagination. How can applying Al-Asabiyya on the army in Egypt or the military power in Egypt contribute to a new understanding of how the power dynamics in Egypt, the power constitution in Egypt, the use of force and the use of Dawah Diniyya, as Sisi in 2013, literally he was talking from the mosques, and you're talking about 21st century, and people still say like, no, it's a modern state and an institution state. Sisi until now start everything about he saying God, he received signs. This is nubu'ah, this is waza' dini and da'wah dini, right? So that's how I read Ibn Khaldun. I read him in not of his time. I read him with a new interpretation of what he meant. I give him a new life, a new form of life. For example, if you are interested about how he applied Syria and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, actually is the most common thesis studies about how Ibn Khaldun can help us understand the post-colonial state in countries like Saudi Arabia and Syria in particular. That actually can open up with you how the Asabiyya was applied. Even in multi-ethnic societies like Syria, but also Saudi Arabia is not multi-ethnic as well, but the rule of religious discourse was very visible. The rule of tribe is very visible. And also go beneath the surface of the modern state in Egypt and go behind the social forces of it. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Ahmed. One could argue that Asabiyya is happening in American politics as well, right?
We will
There's tribal politics to that, yes.
Absolutely.
I want to link that question and your answer to two questions from our audience. First, just quickly on the concept of Asabiyya, we have Farah Marx, who's based in Iran, who sent a question by email asking about Asabiyya, his concept of Asabiyya and urbanization of Bedouins. Could they be used to explain the role of social strata, such as tribes and nomads, in the historical developments of Iran? You mentioned other Middle Eastern countries. What about Iran? And he's making I guess I don't know, Farah Marx, the theories such as Marx's Asiatic mode of production and Wittfogel's Oriental despotism cannot be comprehensive and sufficient to explain the historical developments of some Middle Eastern societies and states. So can we dig more into Asabiya? You mentioned it, but what about Iran? And I want to link to Mariam's question, who thanks you for an interesting talk. Shouldn't we, instead of trying to globalize local thinkers, try to reduce the different Euro-American theories to their own local histories and reject their pretense of universality, which also requires rejecting the notion of universality?
Thank you so much. For Vora as well, if you don't mind, also, I would like to answer here if you have the email, since I hope if she with us. For Iran, again, the same point. As the map, as you kindly notice, Professor Marwa, the map saying everything. This is where the societies were constituted, were formed, right? And my big claims as well, outside the West, this social confrontation was not disrupted, even with the emergence of what the nation state. We still have in every single country, like you said, even in the state, and we will talk about this, and China, of course, and in Ukraine and Russia as well. This traditional structure still exists, maybe marginalized, maybe overlooked, maybe excluded, but still exists and efficient for varied degrees. So, of course, if this social forces still exist and still have impact on the social relation and socio-political relation in any society. So definitely Khaldun and other can be applied. And actually, I mentioned from the modern case studies, the Safavid, Ad-Dawla Safawiya, which is in Iran until the mid-20th century. So actually, Ibn Khaldun has been applied to Iran and other, of course. But my point is, I'm not here, and this is related to Mariam question, which thank you so much. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to replace Ibn Khaldun with others or replace Eurocentricity with Islamic centricity. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to de-link with the imperial knowledge that control our understanding of the world and excluded other. It's not about bringing Europe back or provincialization of the Western knowledge. Actually, they are not interested in provincializing themselves or just apply. This is the knowledge power nexus 101. It's not about you only can apply to Europe. That's not the whole issue. And I'm not trying to universalize Ibn Khaldun, but I'm trying to add a new contribution in a conversation, not excluded or replacement of other. Ibn Khaldun in a conversation with other form of knowledge can expand our understanding. So to be honest, that's me. I'm interested more in a challenge the Eurocentricity, not to dismiss the idea of universality. And that's my positionality. If you start to talk about any topic in the social science, immediately Western knowledge applied immediately, unquestionable. But for me, it's not about I replace them or I would be anti-Western, more than let's have another view, let's have another understanding. Ibn Khaldun cannot explain everything by them. And I will be ignorant if I claim that Ibn Khaldun have certain particular contributions that have been overlooked. That's why I agree with you, Dr. Marwa, that I will call him political theorist, not historian or not political sociologist as everyone claims, but this is the aspect of Ibn Khaldun had been, I will not call erased because it was not discovered, but it was not highlighted, it was not addressed. So let's bring it to the table And we will see to what extent it will stand, or it just can be challenged and it's not it cannot be applied. But the idea of universality, I think you can't ignore it, or you can't escape it. It's power knowledge, and who controls the knowledge controls the power or constitutes the power. So it's not about me trying to decline the universality or provisionation of the Europe, more than I'm interested in bringing new voices and new interpretation of politics and social relations.
Thank you, Ahmed, about hegemonic structures, right? Also, in terms of knowledge production. Any question from, yes, Yukiko.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Yukiko, and I was curious about how Ibn Khaldun was thinking about the process of Abbasiyya to come. The process of Abbasiyya is being shaped, and how the power came to dominant. And in your article, you mentioned that in European modern states, power has become based on class, ethnicity, or profession, and this is not much with Ibn Khaldun's concept. So, to my understanding, given the age of Ibn Khaldun, power is usually, accompanied with the defeating enemy, or just the material power against material power in the world or something. So how Ibn Khaldun generally thinking about the process of Abbasiyya?
Can I repeat the question for our audience, because they might not have heard it quickly? I'll summarize, and if I'm wrong, let me know, Yukiko. So Yukiko is asking about how did Ibn Khaldun conceptualize the concept of Asabiyya in relation to power, and how this has shaped actually the manifestation of power from a material perspective, right? And she would be interested to know about these manifestations and how they were implemented, and how his concept, which appears to look into only the ethnic, professional, and other aspects of material power, have shaped the history of this region in a way, based on your article as well.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, and really I was hoping someone to bring this up as well, because I will come back to the process of Asabiyya formation. But back to the comparison between the West and non-West. In my opinion, the most valid and close argument close to Ibn Khaldun about the role of violence and power coming from Charles Tilly. Charles Tilly have published a great piece called State Make Wars, War Make State, 1987. And in his claim, or his argument, that state actually was organized crime. The process of establishing nation state in the West, as we know, it was organized crime based in coercion, suppression, and war making. Ibn Khaldun have the same argument before Charles Tilly centuries. For him, the goal, the object, the ultimate goal of Asabiyya is authority and domination. And by definition, until now, if you go back to the most accepted definition of political power, is Howard Laswell, right? Who get what, how, and when. This is about resources, right? This is about definition of resources and sharing the resources or controlling the resources. For Ibn Khaldun, and this is the big question of his history, not only al-Muqaddimah, for him, history of mankind or history of humanity is an infinite struggle and contestation between people of the cities and people of the desert or nomads. So the circle of what he called the circle of state building is start from one group share a group feeling or a group solidarity trying to expand their sphere of power. Therefore, they try to expand outside their homelands or territories and establish a state. So the main idea here, again, that's why, like, try to go beyond that. Ibn Khaldun belonged to the 15th century. Call him X or Y. This is someone claim or argue that power or politics is defined in terms of power and domination. And every elite, social forces, dominated group is seeking for rulership, for authority, and for controlling the society and the resources, either through the exportation of syllabus of violence from within to suppress all the competitor, or abroad. In Islam, it was al-jihad, ghazawat, which I believe it was a statecraft. It was a strategy, grand strategy. So Wana Asabiyya, in order to control the power, to establish their authority and consolidate their power, the only available tools for them is through the violence, material violence, and the discourse of violence. The same, I think it was only Charles Tilly, and to some extent, it was Michael Mann, who referred to the constitutive role of violence in establishing the state and community as we know it now, as organized communities. So to understand how Asabiyya developed, constitute, and consolidate, and preserve it, and re-emerge it again, you need to look at an infinite struggle for power and domination. And that's exactly what Ibn Khaldun, as a minister, as ambassador, as a co-orchestrator, as a prime minister, noticed and observed. Every single Asabiyya was not seeking for reform. That's the question about reform and progress. It was not looking for prosperity of the society or the progress of the society. It was infinite struggle for power. And that's why, in my opinion, the limited reading of Ibn Khaldun label him or accuse him of being repetitive or determinated, like everything, the history repeats itself. But actually, he adopted a very dynamic definition or conception of power. Like, for example, if you want to use not only Joseph Knight, that's where the magic happened. The idea of soft power, hard power, and smart power. Ibn Khaldun, if you look at the Al-Ghalabat wal-Shawkat, back to Mahmoud, this is Al-Ghalabat wal-Shawkat, this is the hard power, this is the arms, this is the manpower, this is the war making. And if you're looking for the role of a da'wah diniya or religious or discourse, as I call it now, or soft power, as you know it now, this is soft power. And of course, the successful mixing between the two is the smart power. And this is actually Ibn Khaldun wrote that he was not stubborn with the idea of kills them all, or it's just a religious empire. And actually, that's Ibn Khaldun, not only IR and political science, but also Orientalism, like the dominant narrative about state outside the West, not only Islam, by the way, it's that it was ruled by God, Caliphate, to use Patricia Crone, Michael in Princeton, Michael Cook, and others, that Islamic empires from the 7th century to the 19th century was just theological states. So there was no development, there was no politics. It was ruled by divine. And this is, of course, contradict with everything Ibn Khaldun writing about since the days of Muhammad until his time. So again, I know it's difficult. That's why this is like contestation happened, because you still believe Ibn Khaldun is medieval scholar, not modern scholar as well. It's a very long answer. I'm really sorry.
No, thank you, Dr. Ahmed. There's a related question from our colleague Katy Al-Haik. Hi, Katy, who is based in Canada now, but she taught last year at our center. So I'm pleased that she's with us today. On the question of violence that you just raised and power, Katy is asking, from your research, can you explain more about Ibn Khaldun's complex position on violence, while he supported more authoritarian style of governing.
Thank you so much, Kaji. That's, if anyone, inshallah, want to write PhD, please don't think big. Just try to find one small idea, and good luck if you try to unpack it. So Ibn Khaldun, again, it's 7 volumes, and he literally talk about everything. And I'm sorry, Dr. Marwa, I will share with this. We just was talking about Ibn Khaldun wrote about environment as well, and history, and everything, almost. My new paper about how Ibn Khaldun can be used in understanding Arabic drama. So yeah, anyhow, back to the question about violence. Violence in Arabic is عنف. عين نون فاء, to use القاموس المحيط, which refer to everyday activity, everyday life activities. Interestingly enough, Ibn Khaldun did not use the word عنف ever. He used 3 different words: غلبة, شوكة, and قهر. قهر is the easiest one. قهر شخص أي غلبه. قهر in English is repression. Al-Shawka is the brutal force, as Mahmoud also referred to, which is the group of the people that stand next to you, your supporters, your proponents, your alliance. Al-Ghalaba is domination. And I really struggled to understand why exactly he used these 3 words. And that's why I told you I'm not trying to replace the West with Ibn Khaldun. The closest understanding I found was not Foucault. I spent 18 months reading Foucault, it did not make any sense to me. And still, Max Weber, very limited. The closest understanding, Katia, to the concept of violence in Ibn Khaldun, I found it with Walter Benjamin. So to compare, like back to political science, the idea of violence in Max Weber, he used Macht. Macht is force, not violence. So the state monopolized the idea of using force, which is the police and coercion. Benjamin did not use Macht. He used Gewalt. And Gewalt, as a German friend told me, it's a German word coming from the Bible. I can't pronounce biblical, sorry. So it's coming from the Bible origins, which mean a divine force. So it's not condemned. It's not illegal. It's not illegitimate. But Macht, if it had been used outside the state apparatus, it's illegal. And that's exactly the main problem with terrorism studies. That terrorism, for example, it's only labeled non-state actor because the state is the only entity that monopolizes the use of force or violence, legitimate violence. But Gewalt, let's call it's value-free, since it's constitutive element of state building. And that's exactly how I understand what Ibn Khaldun meant by al-ghalabatu wal-shawka. It's a constitutive component of how a state is established, either with or he was not occupied with the question about legality. And legality is different than legitimacy. Legality is more about morality and value. Ibn Khaldun, for him, and that's where the empirical and professional life affected his scholarly work. He was not interested in about, is this legal or not? Is this acceptable or not? Is this morally or not? Like, for example, Ibn Khaldun stand alone, comparing with most of Arabic and Muslims historian about the clash between Muawiyah and Ali. I think he was the only one. He said Ali have no chance because Ali lack the Gewalt, which is the Umf and the Asabiyya, the driving forces. So his defeat was inventable. He has to lose because to read the history materially, not normative. His reading of history was material reading based on social forces and social power and material power. So for him, violence was not the use of force. It was not the war. It was a constitutive foundation where Asabiyya built its authority and consolidated and preserved it. And that's, in my opinion, the only one explain it in a modern time was Walter Benjamin in his On Violence article, was published in 1921, which, by the way, was a response to Max Weber's idea about monopoly of violence.
Thank you. You're showing us also semantics as an exercise in power, right? And production of knowledge. So that's very, very interesting. Is there a question from the students? If there's none, I'll move on to, yeah, no question? Well, there are two questions from the online participants, Ahmed, about the applicability and the relevance of Ibn Khaldun's thought to different disciplinary fields. And the first one is from Juan, who's asking about the applicability of Ibn Khaldun to historical, political, or sociological studies, focusing on the modern period, post-1500. And for him, the greatest difficulty in citing Ibn Khaldun is that he didn't experience or directly comment on capitalism and European colonialism. That's one question. What do you think he can help us understand about capitalism, European colonialism, and the relationship between these two modern phenomena? The other question from Justin is about what the question brought up within post-colonial theory, referring to Chakrabarty more specifically on the question of which intellectual traditions are universalized and which are historicized, such as Sanskrit. Part of the argument here is that an aspect of post-colonial power is a power to determine what counts as universal knowledge. How might we approach the question of the role of Ibn Khaldun's knowledge today? What are the risks of canonizing Ibn Khaldun in Western academic traditions? And I'll end with a comment by Fatima saying, a comment about it's good to criticize Ibn Khaldun about his position, being racist and also about women, but that's something which is part of the Western tradition as well. One should outline it. I'll leave you with these major questions.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Juan, and thank you, Fatma. It seems coloniality is everywhere. So we like it or not, we are a product of colonial minds. The way we talk now, it's a product of coloniality, as the one you refuse, and we still trying to figure it out how we deal with that. And not being funny, to be honest, because it's very easy to just be loud without actually answering the question. So about short battery, sorry, again, the disability, I prefer not to talk about someone has been accused of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. So I'm not talking about this, and I'm not citing him anymore. But about post-colonial and universality. Post-colonial is a very big problem. And again, I have my personal view and my epistemic view. My personal view, so what? I'm trying to make Ibn Khaldun a canon. I'm trying to make Ibn Khaldun a universal thinker. So what is the problem with that? Why everyone for 500 years claim Western authors are the only universal ones? So what is the problem with that? I don't mind, to be honest, but that's my personal view. In my epistemic view, and I will quote Dr. Marwa, like she said, you can't escape it. This is a structure of power. This is Power domination, this power structure. It's not about me as Ahmed or Marwa as individual to just, we would deconstruct universality. This is something, actually, this talk is coming as a response to this universality. Today you have Ahmed. Next week, I don't know who you will invite, and the next week you will invite. We are trying to diverse our knowledge, right? And they're very highly charged and really become a problem decolonizing the knowledge now, because everyone is decolonizing everything, you know. Either they do it or not. But actually, we're trying. I moved to become more global IR, more than colonizer, or try to decolonize stuff. It's good to have many views. I'm not replacing centricity with another centricity. That's why, like, if you ask me, how can I apply Ibn Khaldun for urban study? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I know political science, political sociology, international relations. I have friends who in Ibn Khaldun with really many things. But that's one view. I have another friend who work with indigenous knowledge from South America. Other people work from Sufism and Buddhism. My supervisor work on Eastern philosophy. Let's have multiple voices. I'm not interested in addressing everything coming from the West. This is exactly the trap. The problem with post-colonial, including Edward Said himself, he centralized Europe. I'm not. If you noticed, my talk about Ibn Khaldun ends when the Portuguese came. I am not. Europe for me, the West in general, broad concept, is not my point of gravity. It's not my center. It's not my hub. I'm not interested in Europe. I'm not interested in criticizing European. I'm not, because Europe is just a part of the world. So I'm bringing Ibn Khaldun now to put it in a conversation with other European. Not really. I'm not interested, honestly. That's exactly, it's like, it's very Hegelian again, European as well. So Eurocentricity as well. It's like you're trying to escape a logic, but you end up adopting the same logic. So you're trying to escape the coloniality of knowledge, but you end up centralizing Europe and trying to have a conversation with Europe. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what Europe missed, what the rest of us missed. This question about Iran, about Erito, sorry for mispronunciation, of course, about the process of Asabiya formation. I want to know more how, like Fukuyama, and it's Fukuyama. Fukuyama speaks in his 2-volume greatly about how political regimes in China, in Egypt, in India was fascinating, was completely advanced. So now we need to celebrate Fukuyama, talk about China and Egypt good? Hell no. We have a scholar from there. We need to revisit them. And I'm not trying to bring him back Ibn Khaldun. I'm not. Don't get me wrong. Bringing back Ibn Khaldun is to discipline Ibn Khaldun. I'm not trying to. This is what he said. This is one interpretation of many interpretations. Mahmoud, he struggled as he said, Ahmed, I can't apply to Egypt. Absolutely. Other people can apply it easily. Like when Dr. Marwa would mention about how Ibn Khaldun in US, for example, during Trump, Professor Carla Nurlov, and I wrote a paper as well. She wrote a paper about how we can understand Trump based on the Asabiya or identity-based solidarity, us versus them, and how we can understand the great power rivalry or competition between China and the US based also on Al-Asabiya and Ibn Khaldun theory of state building and what she called Ibn Khaldun trap. This is, for me, is a fascinating, innovative reading of Ibn Khaldun. It was written during the same time I'm writing my thesis. I am applying in my new paper about how Ibn Khaldun can make us understand Putin's strategy and his colonized war against Ukraine and Eastern Europe countries. So that's all. It's not about universality, postcoloniality. I think this is, we tried to box in ourselves, and I'm very big fan of interdisciplinary and collaborative and non-traditional. I told you, like, I'm trying to use Ibn Khaldun to understand drama, which is completely not political science, not social science, but it's a way of looking to the world. Let's look at it this way. Why, again, Hegel, Aristotle is applied to Hegel is a way to look at the world. Why not Ibn Khaldun? Why not Confucius? Why not Al-Farabi? I have a friend in Netherlands. She wanted to work on Al-Ghazali. I'm anti-Ghazali scholar, but let's bring it to the table. Let's try to open up this gate that it's just only, if it's not Max Weber, it's not Foucault, it's not Zizek, for God's sake, it's not acceptable. Sorry, I have a very strong opinion about other people.
Thank you, Ahmed. Your contribution to IR, your article that you mentioned, and Professor Norlov's article is something we read in another class, my IR students. The cycle of power, the power traps, which in fact Ibn Khaldun could really explain today, right? You talked about great power rivalry, but also Trumpian politics, identity-based, and not only in the US, in Europe as well and elsewhere. So thank you for that comment. Is there a last question from the students? No? And there's a question from the audience here is, will this talk and QA be made available? I believe so, right, Coco? It will be put online? On the YouTube, our YouTube channel, and it's being recorded now. So you will definitely have a chance to come back, revisit, rethink, sort of absorb your very interesting comments. And I want to thank you so much, Ahmed, for joining us today. Very, very challenging, stimulating, revisiting every question, essential questions in politics, in IR, also in political thought, history. And so I think we had a very fascinating session today. Thank you so much. And I look forward to reading more and more your reflections and analysis in the future.
It's coming soon. It's coming soon. The book is coming hopefully next year. And the talk of today, it's 2 papers forthcoming as well. So hopefully.
Looking forward to it. Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you,
so
Coco, for organizing. And thank you all for attending online. I don't know if there are more comments. I don't see any more. Yes, thank you. Everybody's thank you, and for the responses too. So we'll end here, and we look forward to continuing this conversation in listening to you or reading your very prolific publications. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.